My name is Meredith Hale. I'm 34 years old, and on the day I buried my husband, his family changed the locks on my own front door before I got home from the cemetery. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it took me weeks to sit with it myself. I stood in my driveway in my black funeral dress, holding a bouquet of white lilies I never got to put on his grave properly, staring at a man I'd never seen before standing on my own porch like he owned it. And in a way, according to a stack of paperwork with my husband's signature on it, he did. He looked at me and said, "I'm the new owner. The house was sold yesterday." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in the driveway, lilies going soft in my hands, and thought one very simple, very cold thought. Daniel's been dead for 4 days. How does a dead man sign a contract? I found out the answer eventually. It took me 3 weeks, one forensic accountant, one private investigator I didn't know existed, and a sealed envelope my husband had prepared for a day he already knew was coming. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, if this kind of story is the kind that makes you sit up straight, hit like and subscribe now, because you're going to want to see this through to the end. And tell me in the comments how far back would you have gone to protect someone you loved, even after you were gone. Let me take you back 3 years, to the beginning of the end. I met Daniel Hale at a hospital fundraiser in Portland. I was there as a vendor. I run a boutique accounting firm that specializes in small business audits, the unglamorous kind of work nobody notices until something's wrong. Daniel was there because his family's business, Hale Distribution, was one of the gala's sponsors. He was 36, quiet in a room full of loud people, and he found me by the dessert table asking the caterer detailed questions about her supply costs. He said later that was the moment he decided he liked me. I actually cared how numbers moved. We married 18 months later at a small ceremony in his parents' backyard. His mother, Eleanor Hale, wore ivory to my wedding. I noticed. I didn't say anything. That was the first lesson I learned about that family, and I didn't even know I was learning it yet. Here's what you need to understand about the Hale family. Eleanor built the family reputation the way some women build houses brick by brick, over decades, with the specific goal of making sure everyone in their small Oregon town knew the Hales mattered. Daniel's older brother Richard, 41, was the heir apparent. He'd run operations at Hale Distribution for 12 years, badly, but nobody in that family ever said the word badly out loud. Richard drove a truck he couldn't afford, dated women who cost more than his salary, and every single year, without fail, something in the company's books needed restructuring right around tax season. Daniel was the second son, the quiet one, the one who went to business school instead of staying local, who married an accountant instead of someone with a recognizable last name, who Eleanor introduced to guests at parties as my son who does something with computers, even though Daniel had a master's degree in finance and ran risk analysis for 3 regional banks. I want to be honest with you. For the first 2 years of my marriage, I thought Eleanor was simply old-fashioned. A little cold. The kind of mother-in-law who takes time to warm up. I told myself that, over and over, the way you tell yourself things you want to believe. Then Daniel's father died. Gerald Hale passed in the spring of our 2nd year of marriage, and within 4 months, Richard had quietly become CEO of Hale Distribution, not through a vote, not through merit, but because Eleanor announced it at Sunday dinner the way you'd announce a change in restaurant reservations. Daniel didn't argue. That was Daniel. He absorbed things. He kept a straight face and asked me later, in the car, in a voice so flat I almost missed the pain underneath it. Did you notice nobody asked what I thought? I noticed everything. I just didn't know yet how much it would matter. Here's the first real crack. 8 months before Daniel died, at a family dinner, Eleanor mentioned casually, the way she mentioned everything cruel, that Richard was handling some cash flow adjustments at the company. I'm an auditor. Cash flow adjustments is not a real term. It's the phrase people use when they don't want you asking a real question. I looked at Daniel. He didn't look back at me. He just set his fork down very carefully, folded his napkin and said he needed some air. I followed him out to the porch that night. He was standing with both hands braced on the railing, staring at nothing. "I think Richard's stealing," he said, without turning around. "I don't know how much yet. I don't know from where exactly. But I've seen the numbers, Mur. They don't add up." "What are you going to do?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. "Nothing yet," he finally said. "I need proof, not a fight." That was Daniel in one sentence. He never fought loud. He built quiet cases instead. Over the following months, I watched my husband change in small ways nobody else seemed to notice. He started working later. He started keeping a second laptop in his home office that he never opened in front of anyone but me, and even then, only after locking the door behind him. He hired a lawyer named Priya Anand from Seattle, not the family's local attorney. And I only knew because I saw the retainer invoice in the mail before he intercepted it and apologized for not telling me sooner. "I didn't want to worry you until I had something real," he said. I told him I was already worried. I just didn't know it was about to get so much worse. If you've ever watched someone you love quietly prepare for a war they haven't told you about yet, comment the word "watching" below. I want to know how many of us have lived through that particular kind of silence. 6 weeks before Daniel died, I found him at 2 a.m., sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of printed documents and a highlighter, his eyes red from exhaustion, a cold cup of coffee sitting forgotten by his elbow. "What is all this?" I asked, standing in the doorway in my robe. He looked up at me for a long moment before answering, like he was deciding how much of the truth to hand me. "Insurance, Mur," he finally said. "In case I'm wrong about how careful I need to be." I thought he meant business insurance. I thought he meant liability protection, corporate documents, the boring architecture of protecting a company from a lawsuit. I was wrong about what kind of insurance he meant, and I wouldn't understand that mistake until it was far, far too late to ask him what he'd actually meant. Around that same time, Daniel started asking me strange, small questions. Where did I keep our marriage certificate? Did I know the name of my own attorney, the one who'd handled my firm's incorporation years earlier? He asked, once, almost offhand while we were doing dishes, whether I trusted his mother. I remember laughing a little, uneasy, water running over my hands. "That's a strange question to ask your wife on a Tuesday," I said. He didn't laugh back. He just nodded slowly and went back to drying the plate in his hand, like the question had cost him something to ask out loud. I think about that Tuesday more than almost any other memory I have of him now. Daniel Hale died on a Tuesday morning in March. A heart attack. The doctors said sudden. Catastrophic. The kind that gives you no warning even when you're only 38 years old and run 3 miles most mornings. I got the call from the hospital while I was in a client meeting. I don't remember driving there. I remember the fluorescent lights in the ICU waiting room and a doctor with kind, tired eyes telling me they'd done everything they could. I remember Eleanor arriving 20 minutes after me and not once, in the entire time we stood in that hallway together, putting her hand on my shoulder. I remember Richard arriving 40 minutes after that, checking his phone twice before he even asked which room his brother was in. The funeral was 4 days later. Eleanor planned every detail: the flowers, the caterer, the seating chart at the reception, the exact minute the service would end. She kept saying the same phrase to me, over and over, in that gentle voice she used when she wanted something from you without asking directly. "Don't worry about anything, Meredith. We'll handle the family matters." I thought she meant she was being kind. I thought grief had softened something in her. I found out what family matters actually meant when I drove home from the cemetery in my black dress, holding lilies I never got to lay on his grave, because Eleanor had rushed the burial through before I could arrange them properly, and found a stranger standing on my own porch. "I'm the new owner," he said. "The house was sold yesterday. I want to pause here, because I know some of you are already doing the math with me. Yesterday, Daniel had been dead for 4 days. The funeral was that same afternoon. Someone had sold my house the day before I buried my husband, and I hadn't signed a single piece of paper. I didn't yell at the stranger on my porch. My voice came out steadier than I expected when I asked him for his name, and the name of the title company that handled the closing. He gave it to me slowly, a little confused by how calm I sounded. I wrote it down on the back of the funeral program I was still holding, my hand not shaking even once. Then, I got back in my car and drove to my sister's house in Beverton, because I no longer had keys to my own front door. That night, sitting on the edge of a borrowed bed, I called the title company. The woman on the phone was apologetic, but firm. "The sale went through cleanly," she said. "All documents were properly executed. Both signatures are on file." Both signatures. Mine and Daniel's. "I never signed anything," I told her. There was a pause on the line, the sound of someone typing. "The transaction date shows 2 days before the date on file for the death certificate," she said, almost hesitant now. Signed, notarized, filed. I sat there with my phone against my ear and felt something colder than grief settle into my chest. Because if that date was real, it meant one of two things. Either my husband had secretly sold our house without telling me while I was sitting next to him at dinner every night that week, or somebody else had used his name. If you've ever had a piece of information land in your stomach before your brain even finished processing it, you know exactly the feeling I'm describing. Subscribe now if you want to see exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. Because I promise you, this was only the beginning. I requested certified copies of the sale documents the next morning. My sister Claire, who is a paralegal, came with me to the county recorder's office. We sat in a fluorescent-lit records room and laid the pages out on the table like a crime scene, because that's exactly what it was. The signature on the deed transfer looked like Daniel's. Close enough to pass a glance. Close enough, honestly, to pass mine. And I'd been married to the man for 3 years and knew his handwriting the way you know a song you've heard 1,000 times. Claire ran her finger down the notarization stamp at the bottom of the page, then stopped. Went very still. "Meredith," she said slowly. "Look at this date." I leaned in. Read it once. Read it again, the way you reread a sentence when the first reading doesn't make sense. It was the exact date Daniel had been admitted to the hospital. Unconscious. On a ventilator. 40 minutes before his heart stopped for good. My husband could not have signed that document. He was dying in a hospital bed while someone, somewhere, was putting his name on a piece of paper that sold the roof over my head. Claire looked at me across that table, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is fraud." I already knew that. What I didn't know yet was who. There was only one person in the Hale family who had ever had access to Daniel's old identification documents, his notarized signature card from a previous business transaction. And critically, the specific legal knowledge to structure a transfer this cleanly. Richard, I confronted him 3 days later at his condo, uninvited, still wearing the same coat I'd worn to the recorder's office, because I hadn't gone home. I didn't have a home to go to. He opened the door already looking like a man who'd been expecting this conversation and dreading it in equal measure. His eyes went straight to my hands, like he was checking to see if I'd brought something. "You need to leave, Meredith," he said quietly. "You sold my house 4 days before my husband's funeral," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Using his signature, while he was dying. I watched something crack in his face then. Not guilt, exactly. Fear. "I didn't want to do it that way," he said. "You didn't want to." I let that sit in the air between us for a beat. "But you did it." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand still on the doorframe like he might close it on me. Then he said the sentence that turned this whole story sideways, the sentence I did not see coming, and did not believe even a little. "Your husband told me to do it." I laughed. actually laughed in his face, standing in that hallway, because it was such an absurd, desperate thing to say that I couldn't process it any other way in the moment. Richard didn't laugh back. He went inside without a word, and I heard him rummaging through something. When he came back, he was holding his laptop open, already turned toward me. "Read it," he said. "Just read it." It was an email, sent from Daniel's account 4 days before he died, scheduled and delivered automatically. The way you set an email to go out at a specific time even if you're not there to click send. The subject line was blank. The body was one sentence. "If Meredith comes looking for the house, don't stop her." I read it 3 times. I still have that email saved, forwarded to my own account, printed out and folded into my bag even now. "If Meredith comes looking for the house, don't stop her." Standing in that hallway, I felt the ground shift underneath the whole story I thought I was in. Because that wasn't permission to sell my house out from under me. I understood that instantly, the way you understand a joke that only makes sense once you finally get the second half of it. That was an instruction to let me investigate. My husband hadn't told his brother to sell our house. My husband had told his brother not to stop me from finding out why he had to. That was the moment I stopped being a grieving widow standing in a hallway and started being an auditor standing in front of evidence. Here's a question for you while I keep going. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved was protecting you in a way you didn't understand until it was almost too late? Drop a comment. I read every single one. And honestly, some nights, they're the only thing that's kept me steady through all this. I went back to the second laptop. The one Daniel kept locked in his home office. The one Eleanor hadn't thought to look for because, as far as she knew, it didn't exist. I finally had the password Daniel had left it, of all places. Taped inside the cover of a paperback novel on our nightstand, a detail I only found because Claire suggested I search the whole house before Eleanor could get her hands on anything else. What I found on that laptop took me 11 straight hours to fully understand. I sat cross-legged on the office floor, scrolling, clicking, printing. The house so silent around me I could hear my own heartbeat. Daniel hadn't just suspected Richard was stealing. He'd spent the last 5 months of his life documenting it, methodically, the way I would have if I'd been the one investigating. Screenshots of internal hail distribution financial software, photographs of physical ledgers he must have taken with his phone during late nights at the office. Downloaded copies of vendor contracts that didn't match the numbers reported to the company's board. A full spreadsheet, updated weekly, tracking small irregular transfers going back 3 years. The total, when I added the final column, was $780,000. Not one lump sum. Small amounts, systematically bled out $4,000 here, $9,000 there. Dressed up as consulting fees and equipment purchases, and vendor overpayments that were never actually overpaid. It was patient. It was careful. It was exactly the kind of theft you design when you assume nobody in your family will ever check the math. Because why would they? Family doesn't audit family. Except Daniel had married one. I assumed, reading through it, that the money trail led back to a single account under Richard's name. It did. Most of it. But near the bottom of Daniel's spreadsheet, in a column he'd labeled simply secondary transfers, there was a second name attached to a smaller, but still significant slice of that $780,000. Eleanor Hale. I stared at that name for a long time. Long enough that the screen dimmed and I had to tap the trackpad to wake it back up. My mother-in-law, the woman who told me not to worry about family matters, had been quietly funneling money out of her late husband's company for 3 years, alongside her golden boy son, and both of them had decided that the fastest way to secure what was left was to make sure Daniel's widow had nowhere left to stand. I want to tell you about one specific entry in that spreadsheet, because it's the one that finally broke something loose in my chest that grief alone hadn't managed to touch. It was dated the same week as my wedding shower. Eleanor had transferred $22,000 out of the company under a line item labeled Event Coordination Services. The same week, she stood in my parents' living room and gave a toast about how happy she was to welcome me into the family. I remember that toast. I remember her hand on the stem of her champagne glass, her voice trembling with what I thought at the time was sincerity. I sat on that office floor holding my phone with that date on the screen, and finally cried. Not for the money. For how convincingly she'd smiled at me while she was already stealing from her own son. I sat there for a long time afterward, letting the shape of the whole plan settle over me. They hadn't just wanted the house. The house was never really the point. The house was the fastest, cleanest way to destabilize me, grieving, exhausted. Assumed too broken to check paperwork while they quietly consolidated everything else, before I had the presence of mind to look closely at any of it. They planned the funeral timing on purpose. I'm certain of that now. Every detail. Eleanor rushed the burial date. The short service, her insistence that I shouldn't have to deal with logistics, was designed to keep me distracted exactly long enough to get that sale finalized and recorded before I had a chance to object. They made one mistake, though. A big one. They assumed Daniel hadn't seen this coming. The morning after I found the spreadsheet, I called the man who'd been standing on my porch the day of the funeral. I still had his number from the funeral program I'd written it on. My hands were steady when I dialed, which surprised me. "Who do you actually work for?" I asked him. No greeting, no small talk. There was a long pause on the line. Long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. "I think you should sit down for this," he finally said. "My name is Marcus Reyes. I'm a licensed private investigator. Daniel hired me 4 months ago. I want you to imagine standing in your own kitchen, the kitchen you thought had been sold out from under you, hearing a stranger tell you that the man on your porch, the one who told you he was the new owner, had never actually bought anything at all. The sale was never real." That's what Marcus told me, his voice careful, like he was breaking difficult news he'd rehearsed. The house had never legally left my name, not for a single day. What Richard and Eleanor believed was a completed transaction was, in fact, a structured trap Daniel had built with his attorney, Priya Anand, months before he died, designed specifically to force Richard and Eleanor to use forged signatures, file fraudulent paperwork, and expose their own crime in writing, on the record, the moment they tried to move on the house. He knew they'd come for the property, Marcus said. He knew his mother. He knew his brother. He said, and I'm quoting him almost word for word, "They'll move fast, and they'll move while she's too broken to look closely." So we built the version of that scenario he could control. Marcus told me something else that day that I've held on to since. He said Daniel had called him personally 3 separate times in his final month, just to walk through the plan again from the beginning, checking every angle, asking what could go wrong. Marcus said most clients hire an investigator and disappear until the report is done. Daniel wanted to understand every piece of it himself, like he needed to be sure it would work even if he wasn't there to watch it happen. He just never expected to die before he could watch it play out himself. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting very still for a long time. I didn't cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think people expect tears in this part of the story, and what I actually felt was something quieter and far more complicated. Grief and gratitude occupying the same square inch of my chest. He knew. He knew he might not get to protect me in person. So he built a version of himself that could protect me anyway. 2 days later, Priya Anand called and asked me to come to her office. Her voice on the phone was gentler than I expected from a Seattle attorney I'd never met in person. "There's something Daniel left specifically for this moment," she said. "A sealed envelope. He gave me instructions not to open it until his family made a move on the house. They'd made their move. So she handed it to me." I sat in a leather chair across from her desk, the envelope heavier in my hands than paper should ever feel, and opened it slowly. Inside was a letter in Daniel's handwriting. The same handwriting I'd memorized over 3 years of grocery lists and birthday cards. He wrote that he wasn't leaving me the house, not directly, because he knew a house alone wouldn't be safe from people determined enough to fake a signature. Instead, 18 months earlier, quietly, without telling anyone in his family, he had placed our house along with something far larger into an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary. The trust didn't just hold the house. It held his controlling shares in Hale Distribution. Shares he had never told his family he'd been slowly, legally consolidating for 2 years, buying out smaller family stakeholders one at a time under the radar, until he held the majority position in the very company Richard believed he'd already inherited. Near the end of the letter, he wrote something I read so many times the paper started to soften at the fold. He said, "I don't know if I'll be there when this matters. But I know you, Mer. You'll follow the numbers wherever they lead, even when it hurts. That's why I trusted you with this, and not them." I read that line out loud, quietly, alone in Priya's office, just to hear it in my own voice. It sounded like something he would have said across the kitchen table, not something written for a moment he wouldn't live to see. Richard and Eleanor had spent 3 years quietly stealing from a company, and in trying to force a grieving widow out of her home before she could ask a single hard question, they had unknowingly handed that same widow, on paper and in law, control of everything they'd been stealing. If you're sitting there right now thinking there's no way this is real, I understand completely. I sat in that lawyer's office and thought the exact same thing. But grief does strange things to timing, and sometimes the people who love us most are already 3 steps ahead of a fight we don't even know is coming. 2 weeks later, I sat across a conference table from Richard and Eleanor at Hale Distribution's headquarters, with Priya beside me and a folder of documents in front of both of us. I hadn't told them what I'd found. I'd only requested a meeting to discuss the estate, a phrase deliberately vague enough that Eleanor assumed I was coming to negotiate, maybe beg, maybe accept whatever settlement they were prepared to offer to make the ugly business of Daniel's death go away quietly. Richard opened with confidence. He always did. "You really think you can take this company from us?" he said, almost smiling, leaning back in his chair like a man who'd already won. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "Let the silence do some of the work." "I'm not taking anything," I said. I slid the trust document across the table, the paper making a soft, deliberate sound against the wood. "Daniel already gave it to me." The room went very quiet. I watched Eleanor reach for the papers with the exact same hand she'd once refused to put on my shoulder in a hospital hallway, and I watched her read the line, naming me as sole beneficiary. Then read it again, as if a second pass might change the words on the page. Richard's face didn't move at first. Then it did. All at once, the way a dam doesn't crack slowly, it holds and then simply gives. "This isn't real," he said, his voice climbing. "This is fabricated. You had that lawyer make this up after he died." "The trust is dated 18 months ago," Priya said calmly, not raising her voice to match his. "Filed, notarized, and witnessed, while Daniel was very much alive. We're happy to provide the county's certified records if you'd like to verify." I let that sit for a moment. Then I placed the second document on the table. The spreadsheet. Every transfer. Every date. Every dollar of the $780,000, laid out in Daniel's own careful handwriting and cross-referenced against Hale Distribution's official filings. Eleanor's hands started to tremble around the edge of the pages. It was such a small detail, but I noticed it because I'd watched her hands stay perfectly still through her own son's funeral. Money made them shake. Grief hadn't. "Eleanor," I said quietly, and she looked up at me, her face pale. For just a second, one single second, I saw something almost human cross her expression. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to recognition, like she was finally seeing herself the way I'd seen her all along. It didn't last. Her jaw tightened, and the mask came back down. I didn't scream. I didn't call either of them a thief out loud, though God knows I wanted to. I simply said, "You changed my locks while I was burying my husband." I let the silence hold, long enough that I could hear the ventilation humming overhead. "I changed your future." Here's what happened to everyone in the months that followed, because I know you're wondering, and honestly, I think you deserve the full accounting the way I finally got mine. Richard resigned as CEO of Hale Distribution 11 days after that meeting, under advice from a criminal defense attorney who told him a public fight over the trust would only accelerate a fraud investigation into both the property sale and the missing $780,000. He now works, as far as I know, in equipment sales for a company 2 states away. He hasn't contacted me since. Eleanor's part in the theft was smaller in dollar amount, but far more damaging socially. Once it came out, word travels fast in a small town. And a small town that had spent decades admiring the Hale name found out, in a matter of weeks, exactly what that name had actually been built on. She sold the family's Victorian house on Maple Street, the one she'd hosted every holiday in for 30 years, and moved into a condo across the county. She sent me one letter, unopened by me still, sitting in a drawer, because I decided some doors don't need to be reopened just because someone finally wants to knock. The title company that processed the fraudulent house sale lost its license within the year, after the state investigation found this wasn't Richard's first attempt at a quiet transaction of questionable legality. That part, at least, felt like a small piece of justice that had nothing to do with me directly. The notary whose stamp appeared on the forged deed, a woman named Susan Petrakis, who worked out of a strip mall office near the county line, was found to have backdated dozens of documents over the years for a fee and lost her commission entirely. Priya told me later that once investigators started pulling that thread, 3 other unrelated fraud cases in the county came loose because of it. I didn't ask for that. It happened anyway, the way honest math tends to expose more than you were originally looking for. There's one person who surprised me in all of this, and I want to give her credit. Because not everyone in that family chose the same path. Daniel's cousin Priya, no relation to my lawyer, small towns are like that, had known nothing about the theft, and when the whole story broke publicly during the fraud investigation, she was the only member of the extended family who called me, not to ask about the trust or the money, but simply to say she was sorry for my loss, sincerely. Months late, but not too late to matter. "I should have called sooner," she told me on the phone, her voice cracking a little. "I didn't know what to say. I still don't. But I didn't want you to think none of us noticed. We still talk occasionally. It's not much. But it's honest. And honest was in short supply that year." As for Hale Distribution, I now hold the controlling shares my husband quietly built for 2 years, without ever telling a single member of his own family. I didn't want to run a company. I run an accounting firm. I know exactly what I'm good at, and operations wasn't it. So, I hired an outside CEO, a woman named Denise Okoro, with 20 years of distribution experience and 0 personal history with the Hale name. And I sit on the board now, once a quarter, watching the numbers the way Daniel used to watch them. Careful, patient, making sure nobody quietly bleeds it dry again. I still live in the house. My house. The one they tried to take on paper for exactly 1 day before Daniel's own trap unwound it back into my name for good. Here's what I want you to take from all of this, if you've stayed with me this far. I used to think love was the big loud gestures, the flowers, the anniversary trips, the things you can photograph. What I learned, in the worst way possible, is that sometimes the deepest kind of love is quiet and administrative. It's a man sitting up at 2 a.m., with a highlighter, building a case nobody asked him to build, because he suspected he might not be there to fight it in person. Daniel didn't leave me a house. He left me proof that he'd seen exactly who his family was, years before I fully understood it myself, and he spent the last months of his life making absolutely certain that when they came, for what was mine, they'd hand me everything they'd been hiding, on a silver platter, with their own signatures attached. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the quiet ways people protect the ones they love, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that grief doesn't always mean you're defenseless. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in my position. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. Because I promise you, this won't be the last time someone underestimated exactly who they were dealing with.